Right. Hello and welcome to the Alliance Conversation series and to today's program, Embracing Cultural Differences Through Cultural Humility. My name is Corey Bryant, Senior Director of Communications for the Alliance, and we have an outstanding conversation planned for you today, and we want you to be a part of it. So that said, just a heads up, we received a large number of registrations for today's program, and that's fantastic. That said, we have a large number of questions already lined up. So just so you're aware, due to the considerable interest in today's program, we may be going for the full hour today as opposed to the normal half hour that we allot for today's program. So we encourage you to stick around. We think there'll be some great conversation ahead. Before we get started, we have just a few recommendations for making this afternoon successful. First, make sure you update your name in Zoom. So if you navigate over to the Participants tab, click beside your name, you'll see a button that says More, and click on that, you'll see an option that says Rename. We recommend changing your name to include your first and last name, and maybe include the organization that you represent, just like you see here. And that'll help us as we call on you during the course of the conversation. Also, you'll notice that your audio has been muted automatically upon logging in. And for the sake of time for this program, the audio lines will remain muted for the duration of the discussion. There will be opportunities for verbal engagement in the future programs as it relates to this topic. Now, that said, we really encourage you to engage with your colleagues in the chat, provide commentary, and most importantly, ask questions. Our presenters will be drawing from your input during the course of today's discussion. So I'll kick us off with our first chat topic. Why do you think cultural competence is important as it relates to donation and transplantation today? Pop your answers in the chat as we get started. A couple of quick notes before we get started with today's program. An email will be distributed following the conclusion of the program with outlined instructions on how to access the post-event evaluation. So we really encourage you to give us your feedback on how these programs can be improved in the future. Tell us what you like, what you want to see more of, maybe what you don't like, and what topics you would like to see moving forward. A certificate of attendance will be provided upon completion of the evaluation. CEs are not offered for today's program. Also, this session is being recorded, and an on-demand recording will be made available on our website following the conclusion of today's program. So now on to the fun part. It's my pleasure to introduce two wonderful people and incredible colleagues. We're honored to be joined by Hedi Aguiar, who is the founder of Fundamental Roots. And as many of you may also remember, Hedi is a veteran senior director of programs here at the Alliance. Moderating today's program is my friend and colleague, Deanna Fenton, program manager for the Alliance. Ladies, take it away.
Thanks, Corey.
Oh, it makes me feel so old.
Well, hello, everyone. I have to say, I am truly honored to be serving as a moderator on today's panel as we collectively embark on a journey to achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is an area that I think we can all agree has a significant impact on organ donation and transplantation, and admittedly has become an increased area of focus within our community of practice. Now, as we all know, achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion, both professionally and personally, can be somewhat of a daunting task. So bearing that in mind, the Alliance is making a concerted effort to help you tackle some of those DEI-specific challenges. And that, fortunately, starts here with today's discussion. That said, I am delighted to announce the launch of the Alliance's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion-focused conversation series. Through this series, we will focus on the critical topic of diversity in healthcare through unique and targeted discussions. Our next session, for example, will explore cross-cultural communication through cultural intelligence. Today's conversation is intended to help us build the necessary foundation in order for us to achieve that. So today, we will focus specifically on leveraging our differences to improve our interactions through cultural humility. Now, developing cultural humility is especially critical to our daily practices as healthcare professionals, and even as individuals who come across diverse populations each and every day. As I'm sure we'll learn here today, part of showing cultural humility is not only about acknowledging the fact that each of us brings a unique perspective to the table, but it's also about accepting and embracing those differences in an effort to foster healthy, respectful relationships with those around us. Some may say that that's easier said than done, but ultimately, I do think we have to start somewhere. So it's my hope that today's conversation will serve as that beginning, or maybe even that next step for some of us, to a more mindful approach to our daily interactions, whether it be with our loved ones, our friends, our colleagues, and especially our patients and their families. Now, to do so, we do have to be mindful of the sensitive but important considerations that ultimately impact our ability to develop cultural humility, including race, ethnicity, and culture. Now, as I'm sure my colleagues joining me today would agree, conversations of this nature do have a tendency to get a bit uncomfortable. Now, we certainly recognize that, but if we're going to enact change, I think it's important for us to take the steps necessary to learn to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. Now, having said that, before we begin today's discussion, I would like to establish some basic ground rules. So during our time together, we certainly encourage you to join the conversation to not only share your thoughts and maybe even your experiences, but to ask questions. Our dialogue today is intended to serve as a learning opportunity for each and every one of us. Bearing that in mind, however, I do want to emphasize that this is intended to be a safe space. We want you, all of you, to feel comfortable and empowered to share your diverse perspectives without judgment. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we're all here to learn. So I think it's important that we listen with an open mind and be respectful of each other's points of view. Now, with that in mind, I would also like to reiterate, as Corey mentioned earlier, today's discussion is being recorded and will be made publicly available. So having said that, please be mindful of your commentary with respect to any personal comments or stories or thoughts that you may wish to share. Now, of course, I don't want to monopolize our time together, so I'm going to go ahead and begin today's discussion by welcoming, once again, my former colleague and a well-respected professional within the community, Hedi Aguiar. And also joining us for today's discussion, as you may have noticed, is my colleague, Glen, who serves as a program consultant here with the Alliance and is also a mentor to many emerging leaders in the organ donation and transplantation field. So I'm delighted to welcome you both, and I thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Deanna. I think you're on a roll. I think you should just continue here. Lots of really valid points already. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very delighted and excited to rejoin the Alliance team here for this session today. Thank you for, Glenn, I think you were the first one to reach out to me about this topic today. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to share. Sorry, go ahead, Deanna.
We certainly appreciate you joining us. And I think one of the reasons that we're so excited to have you with us is just given your unique background and expertise. You offer a really great, you can offer great insight rather to this topic specifically. But for those who may not be as familiar with you, would you mind just sharing a little bit about yourself and your passion for this area?
Yeah, absolutely. So where my passion all started for this topic is right here. So I grew up in Indonesia. So very briefly, short version of the story is I'm half English, half German. And I grew up in Indonesia, so my accent is going to change all the time. I just moved to Tennessee, so I might start throwing in some y'alls here and there. I'm starting to learn a little bit about the culture in Tennessee. And so I grew up right here in Indonesia. Unfortunately, the tsunami back in, I can't remember, early 2000s put Indonesia on the map for many people. And I went to school, that's where I grew up, remotely on Sumatra. And then I went to school first in Baguio City in the Philippines. And then I went to school in Singapore. Eventually went to college in Germany and then nursing college in England. I met my husband is Brazilian, and then we together immigrated to the US. So that's a little bit about my background. I'm not going to proclaim to be an expert because I think developing skills in communication and cross-cultural communication is an ongoing journey. It's not something as a one-time learning. It's something that we have to keep working on. But I definitely feel that I have had the opportunity just because of life, the life that was in a sense imposed upon me, just the cultural humility that had to develop from that.
I can certainly say, I mean, your story never ceases to amaze me. I've been working with you for a few years, and yet I love to hear just all about how you were raised and your upbringing and all of that. And, when I consider how many different cultures and languages and ultimately the people that you've come across in your lifetime, I always wonder, would you say, having lived in so many different countries, you've been somewhat forced to be flexible and adapt to your surroundings?
Yeah, and that's really what cultural humility is about, is that flexibility and adaptability to the people around you.
Well, I'm sure I speak for all of us in attendance here today when I say that we are excited and eager to learn more about that skill and how to further develop it. But I think before we dive into that, it may be beneficial for us to maybe start off with some clarification on certain terminology that's used in relation to culture, just to ensure that we're kind of all on the same page with that. So do you mind walking us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I did want to note, I often get that comment that, you know, oh, your life is so interesting. I think it's important to recognize we all have very individual stories and personal stories. And when we take the opportunity to listen to each other, and we'll hear a little bit about both of your stories today as well, we'll start tapping into this rich, amazing resources of stories in each other's lives that we can learn from. But I think, to your point, the basic definitions is absolutely crucial for this conversation. And that's where I always like to start when I do any of these types of trainings, because look, there is so much theory and information out there. It can be really overwhelming, and it can be intimidating. And quite frankly, sometimes I feel like there's almost like somebody's finding a new term with a new definition just for the sake of it. And before you know it, you're in the weeds of the theory, and you forget sight of what is just practical and usable. And I think sometimes it's just go back to the basics. And so I'm really only mostly going to focus on the basic definitions today, because I think that's where it really all starts. And the first one really being something that I observed a lot is that a use of the term culture when we're really trying to say something else. So this is just my personal perspective. I want to preface that. This is my experience coming in from the outside in, from being somebody who immigrated to the US, watching people's interactions and communication. It feels to me that quite often there's a discomfort in using the term race, and then the term culture is being used to replace that. And then we end up not really speaking the same language.
I would certainly agree with that. I think that, to your point, only contributes to our misunderstanding of each other's cultural differences. So why don't we, if you're okay with it, why don't we start with maybe defining race specifically?
Yeah, so let's start with race. The term race is really about physical traits. So the very common definition I found here by Dr. Perry Bomar is, and this is very common, if you look at anthropological terminology in terms of race, it's an ancient, non-scientific political classification of human beings. And it's based on physiological characteristics, so skin color, shape of eyes, and texture of hair. Now, my understanding is this definition, this terminology of race started back in the colonial days when they were trying to categorize people and differentiate people based on appearance. And as I said, primarily based on skin color, shape of eye, and texture of hair, bone structure. So there were three primary races identified. A fourth one was added later on. But that's when you start saying, okay, there's a problem, right, with classifying people based on race, because here you're making it's firstly too broad. Secondly, you're making an assumption based on somebody's appearances and their looks. And now we're starting to wander into very dodgy territory. And so I'm not a big fan of categorizing people based on race, because it's just not helpful at all.
I can certainly see that. So would you say, just thinking of that definition, is ethnicity a breakdown of race, or is there association there?
Yeah, so ethnicity is a little bit different. You can have race broken down into multiple different ethnicities, but ethnicity, what ethnicity is really about, and I have a definition here, it's a sense of people who share an ancestry. There's a sense of peoplehood, there's a sense of community, and within that group you will have shared values, customs, beliefs. So religion can be very much entwined with ethnicity. But it's important to recognize that they are two different terms. So for example, you can say the Asian race, which is not really traditionally the terminology for the Asian race, but today we say the Asian race, you can have a breakdown of different countries represented, right? But even within that, if you looked at Indonesia, for example, where I grew up, it's a very homogenous society from an outsider's perspective looking in. You might think everybody looks the same here. But when you actually are Indonesian or you live in Indonesia for a long time, you can start seeing the differences because based on the islands that they're from, they might have a little bit of a different appearance. Again, you have to be careful not to make assumptions. But in addition to that, if you look at Indonesia as a population, there's actually estimated over 1,300 different ethnicities within Indonesia alone, which means each of these groups have a sense of peoplehood, a sense of community, a sense they have their own shared customs, values, and beliefs and practices. So it can be a breakdown, but on the flip side, you can also have people who identify with the same ethnicity, but yet be classified as a different race. And here is a very, very interesting, I think the best example possible I can give you. Let me show you this picture. So we have here these girls. Well, guess what? They're twins. You cannot, the one picture is at them at a younger age and then at an older age. You cannot get closer related than twins from an ethnicity perspective, right? They have identically the same ethnicity. But yet, if we were to look at their racial classification, they would be classified as two different races. And to me, this is one of the most powerful examples. And you can find a lot of these examples, by the way, online. But this is, to me, one of the most powerful examples of showing how just looking at somebody's race doesn't tell me anything about that person.
That's a great example, phenomenal example. I don't think I ever considered that until I saw that, so thank you. But when we talk about customs and values, beliefs, and all of that, and how that feeds into one's ethnicity, how does then one define culture in that respect?
Yeah, so culture is actually a very complex term. Culture is about our values, our beliefs, our practices. So there's multiple variables involved in defining culture. So first you have ethnographic variables, and ethnographic variables are things like what we, I think, commonly use to replace the term culture with, which would be your ethnicity or your nationality, the language you speak. Religion, as I said, could be part of ethnicity as well. But then there are other variables we also have to consider that also define our culture. For example, demographic variables like your gender identification. There is culture that comes with gender identification. I mean, we saw books that were written that women are from Mars and what is it? Women are from Venus and men are from Mars, or men are from Mars and women are from Venus, something like that. Because there are, even with gender identification, there's differences, and that can get more complex, right? And then also think about generational differences culturally. We have a lot of variation in generations in our culture. Then you have status variables. Can you think of what status variables might be?
Like a socioeconomic or educational status?
Yeah, and I apologize. I can hear this background noise. I'm so sorry. Can you guys hear that?
Not too loudly on my phone, no.
Okay, good. I'm so sorry. I think somebody showed it up a little too early for their appointment here. So we have, in terms of status variables, we have social economic status, like you said. There is differences in that can bring its own culture with it. And then there's educational status as well. Think about the way somebody was educated, the level they were educated to, how they were educated. That also can define your culture. And then in addition, you're dealing with, think about caste systems in different religions, for example, that can also define your values. And then add to that, you also have affiliation variables you have to consider. Can you consider what that might be?
Such as a political group affiliation?
Yeah, for example, absolutely. Political affiliation, any interest groups, any affinity group that you have something in relation that you are drawn to and you affiliate with, that you share values with. So if you start thinking about all of these variables, there's a lot of factors that come into defining our culture. And so there's this definition that I like to use. It's a bit of a mouthful. It says that culture is defined as a specific set of social, shared, educational, religious, and professional behaviors, practices, and values that individuals learn and ascribe to while participating in or outside of groups with whom they typically interact. It's a mouthful, but basically what it's saying is culture is something you learn. It's something, it's values that are instilled in you and that evolve over time, because externally our world is evolving, and then internally you're growing and evolving too. So if you think back to how you were raised and the values that were instilled in you, the expectations and beliefs and practices that were instilled in you, and then think about your life's journey, the friends you made, the teachers you had, the mentors, coaches, the education you pursued or the trade you pursued, the line of work, all of these things start changing our own culture and changing our values. And then the people you chose to share your life with, the people you spend time with, and you start adopting new values from them. And so consequently, it's something that's evolving outside of us. It also is instilled in us, but it is also something that grows within us. Now, you can have common shared values and practices within a nation or an ethnicity that you might choose to abide by because you feel it's important to you. But we cannot assume that every person that we're interacting with has those same values, because internally we're constantly changing too. Am I making sense?
So that makes complete sense. I think about my own self, you know, I've changed over time. Certainly I don't share the same values or beliefs that I did as a child versus now, or maybe even a week ago. So yeah, that completely makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody here on today's call, Glenn, I mean, what about you? If you think back to how you were raised by your family and by whomever raised you, do you still ascribe to exactly the same beliefs, values, and practices today as what you were raised with?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the fact that I was born and raised in Hawaii and then moved to the mainland, my values and, all my cultural practices have changed. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then think about, do either of you have siblings?
I do, yes. I'm one of 4. I have 3 brothers.
Okay, and how about you, Glenn?
I'm one of 4 also. I'm the eldest son. I've got 2 brothers and a sister.
There you go. So how do you feel you have exactly the same values, beliefs, and practices as your siblings?
I would say no. When I think about it, despite the fact that we are siblings and we all were raised, or born at least in the same country, the same place, same family, between my older brother and myself, who were born in the Caribbean and eventually moved to America and spent the majority of our lives here, compared to my 2 younger brothers who spent their entire lives in the Caribbean, I would certainly say there are some distinct differences between our values and our beliefs and kind of just our overall thought processes on things.
How about you, Glenn?
Yeah, likewise. My family, between my siblings and myself, we're all very, very different. They have remained on the islands, and I moved to the mainland, so consequently, I'm a little more progressive in my thinking, my practices, socioeconomically as well. So, we're very much different.
And I think that's an important thing to recognize, that no matter who you're interacting with, whether even at your own siblings, you are always in a cross-cultural conversation, because we each have our own life's journey that molds and shapes us. And I think that's so important to remember, because if we forget that piece, we start making assumptions that other people are thinking the way we're thinking, valuing what we're valuing, and now we start running into problems. So that's why I think it's so important to start with these definitions and have this conversation. Now, that also brings us to that, again, we tend to make a lot of assumptions based on observation, right? So Deanna, I would wager to say a lot of people might make the assumption that you're African American. Is that correct?
Certainly says so based on my appearance, yes.
And may I ask, do you identify as African American?
So it's interesting. I think when we were having some earlier conversations putting this program together, I really had to think about that. And the reality is I don't think that I do. Despite being an American citizen, I still attribute a lot of who I am to my West Indian heritage. And of course, my ancestry to some extent can be traced back to Africa, but I can't necessarily say that I share the same values or beliefs or even the practices that a lot of African natives do. So for that reason, the term, to me at least, for African American doesn't necessarily resonate with me. So when I am commonly asked or have this conversation, I typically will say that I'm Black, but may also call specific attention to my Caribbean background and that I'm West Indian.
Very interesting. Yeah, and see, that's a great example of, if we don't ask, we don't know, right? It's so easy just to make that assumption. Glenn, I know we've known each other for a long time. I think I can put you on the spot here. How would you identify?
Well, typically I identify myself as Asian Pacific Islander, but I know the forms do not match often. So I generally have to list myself as Asian, but typically I do feel myself as an Islander. You know, I practice some of the Hawaiian customs and some of their spiritual beliefs I hold very dear to myself. And in life, and some of my recreation include attending Hawaiian festivals. So yeah, I'm very, very different.
Yeah. So does it bother you when people categorize you as Asian?
Initially, when I was a kid, yeah, but quite frankly, no. As I age, I have become more comfortable with my Asian heritage. You know, I am more of a practicing Buddhist than I was younger. And, you know, so, one changes.
Yeah. And I think, again, we'll talk about this a little right at, I think, towards the end as to why sometimes we might be bothered by certain categorizations. But hopefully at this point, the participants have a good feel for how complex the term culture actually is, and how much more there is involved, and how each person has their own culture, and we have to be mindful of that.
Well, it's interesting that Farm from Donor Network West, one of our colleagues, also feels that, you know, there's very much differences in practices, you know, from her parents to her siblings. So we're getting that sort of feedback as well.
I think we've covered a lot of great material so far. So just for the perspective of our audience, and just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page and have the understanding based on these definitions that we set forward, when we think of the term culture as it relates to a group of people, and again, that's regardless of the group, so it could be family, siblings, you know, professional groups, things of that nature, but no matter the group, we have to remember that we're always going to be talking about a multicultural group, right? So even if the individuals have shared traits or a shared race or even the same ethnicity, we have to account for that individual and realize that each person still is going to carry their own interpretation of their culture. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly right. And I think we should speak more plainly and clearly with each other when we're talking about certain things. So for example, you know, just this is a simple example, but for example, if you looked at these two pictures, hopefully at this point you'll realize these are both multicultural groups. They're not multiracial, but they're multicultural. They could be multi-ethnic groups. We don't know that because we don't know what everybody's ethnicity is here. But these are multicultural groups. So I think when we're speaking about certain things, we want to make sure we're speaking clearly what we're trying to communicate. So if we're concerned about race not being represented, or ethnicities not being represented, or religion not being represented, or certain genders not being represented, or abilities, etc., I think we need to just speak more clearly, use correct terminology, and not try to muddy the waters.
So in the respect of correct terminology, we did receive this question during the registration process. So I was wondering if you could help us kind of understand the issue surrounding the use of the word minority when describing marginalized groups, because I often hear the term multicultural used in its place, but I'm just thinking based on our conversation so far that maybe that's not necessarily the best term to use either. So do you have any thoughts on that or any recommendations as far as the proper terminology?
Yeah, and transparently, as it goes with this topic, there are always new things to consider that come up, and there are really valid points, and it's good to listen through those. And this, very transparently, for me, was also a new conversation and new realization, and kind of looking into it. The history of the term minority was more to identify a smaller group of people that were distinctly different to the majority of the population. And that smaller group having their own shared values, customs, beliefs, and practices. And so they were considered a minority in terms of that it wasn't the majority of the people, they were in the minority. Unfortunately, a lot of the times, these minority groups were singled out or oppressed or suppressed or marginalized, in terms of marginalized meaning pushed to the side, not seen as important, not valued. And so consequently, over time though, if you think about the verbiage minority, we have to think about the connotations of that. And if you start classifying people as minority, there's a lot of connotations that come with the term being a minor, being a minority. It could be seen as being minimized or being devalued or depressed. Plus, on top of that, it's not really true anymore today. What they're saying today is, what was classified as a minority is becoming now more of the majority. And so that's why, again, it's a different term than culture, as we can see. I think what gets tricky here is, if you ask somebody, well, what should you be using? You get different answers. And that's where it gets really complicated, quite frankly. I think for me, it goes back to what is the intention driving this? Where is this coming from and why? And I think what we have to recognize is each person individually is going to perceive things differently. So when I'm interacting with an individual, I need to ask them for help. I need to ask them, if I say, and I think a lot of it has to do with how we approach our conversation. And if they, if first of all, I think it's best probably not to try and categorize anybody in any way. That's probably the safest way, and recognize we're all individuals. If for whatever reason we need to categorize, then ask the individual what terminology do you prefer? Or please correct me if I'm saying something that's offending you. Even just giving them the permission to correct you can be helpful. And then in addition, I think we also need a whole dose of grace in all of this for each other and gently help each other learn and speak to each other. I remember I used inappropriate terminology because a lot of what we use is what we learned from somebody. There's not usually, in most cases, any harm intended. It's just ignorance and things that we've learned over time, and we might be completely unaware that we're offending somebody. And I remember when I was in nursing college, a friend pulling me aside and just telling me, I prefer if you don't use this terminology. I prefer to use this. And she gave me another suggestion, and I was like, oh, I'm so glad you corrected me, because I really had no idea I was using terminology that wasn't sitting well with her. You know what I mean? And I think that is a beautiful example of just gently redirecting each other.
What a beautiful, beautiful takeaway for that. Thank you for sharing. I hope, well, what I gather so far is that really the importance of engaging with others is making sure that you're meeting them where they are and being very diligent about your use of the terms that you're using when engaging with others. Mm-hmm. So before we move on, I'd just like to ask you what you think the most important thing is for us to remember with respect to cultural diversity.
I think ultimately the most important thing to remember is we're dealing with human beings. We're all human beings, and every human being has their own needs. And we, no matter what model you look at, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, if you look at Tony Robbins' 6 basic human needs, or whichever other model you want to use out there. No matter whom you're interacting with a human being who has these needs. And ultimately, how the difference is how we perceive those needs being met. That's going to be different from person to person. So that's the part that we have to figure out is how is, for example, significance met for you, Deanna, or for you, Glenn, versus how I would perceive it. That's where we start having the differences within the context of our cultural framework.
Well, I would say, I'm sure folks would agree with me here, but that in some cases does present a challenge. I think part of it, how do we as essential strangers in some cases become familiar with or know what one's needs are in a cultural context? How do we identify those needs?
Yeah, and so it takes effort, right? And the first effort, I think, has to be, and we have to overcome our own barriers. So there are the common barriers. There are 6 really common barriers. Anxiety, if we're nervous about having conversations with somebody, we're worried about offending, we've intimidated. Stereotyping, prejudice, that is a huge one that we could be doing unintentionally even. We might be very consciously biased. We could also be doing it unintentionally because the media feeds a lot, and social media feeds a lot of stereotypes and prejudices. Language problems, the differences in how we communicate and what we communicate, that also ties in with our nonverbal communication. There are a big key that we don't have time to delve into here is communication and culture are very much entwined, and we can't forget that, but that's where a lot of misunderstandings can happen. Ethnocentrism or even racism. This is negatively judging another race or ethnicity by your own ethnicity or racial expectations. So the minute you see somebody, you kind of using your own race or your own ethnicity as the gold standard, basically. And anybody who doesn't fit within that and isn't doing what you're expecting them to do is judged, basically. And you start treating them differently. And then also any assumptions we make. Now, I have to say, the way our brains function, we cannot avoid assumptions. However, we need to avoid running with our assumptions. When we allow assumptions to dictate our actions or dictate our communication, that's when we run into problems. Now, spending time reflecting on what are my barriers? Every single person on this call, Deanna, Glenn, me, anybody on this call here today has barriers. The problem is a lot of the time we don't make the time to self-reflect. And this can be an uncomfortable self-reflection because you have to be brutally honest with yourself. And then you have to dig down deep and figure out where is this coming from? What's triggering my barriers? And then you need to start coming up with an action plan to overcome it. I wish we had a bit more time to delve into this, but this is another huge topic in itself. But I think just spending time self-reflecting and recognizing and acknowledging your barriers and then start working on overcoming them is your first step.
What would you say is the potential next step? I know we don't have time to explore that maybe in great detail, but
yeah, so the second step is really something that Glenn is really good at. Glenn, what are you really good at?
Well, after being in the healthcare industry for over 2 decades, I really feel that it's really how you approach someone and really asking that very respectful but sensitive question, like you mentioned earlier, asking permission or asking someone to help me understand, something about you or things like that. There's always the language that you use in communicating with someone is always crucial. And having that sort of humble position will open doors for you. That's what I've learned over the course of time.
Yeah, asking questions is really key. And I think that's one other thing that I observed, again, just my personal observation, moving from the outside into the US, appeared to me that people were so afraid to offend that they ended up offending because they didn't ask. They were so afraid to ask questions because they were worried they're going to offend. And then they unintentionally, because they read a book, for example, one like this that you often find in ICUs, being an ICU nurse, you can say that, whatever books you have out there, or you attend a workshop and you start assuming that everybody who identifies with that ethnicity or that religion will agree with the findings in that. And then you unintentionally stereotype people. And instead of just asking the individual, because we're complicated. I mean, as we identified, we're complicated human beings.
Well, I think that's especially important in our field as it relates to patient care. On the other side of that, discussions with potential donor families, to your point, we know faith and culture play a huge role in dictating a family's views and beliefs, especially as it relates to their own medical treatment or in certain situations when it comes time to consider the opportunity for donation. And I can say that this is a question we received quite a number of times from our participants. So I'm curious to see if you have any advice on this, but how would you recommend approaching certain situations in which families express that their religious or cultural beliefs don't support donation or brain death declaration or blood transfusions, things like that?
Yeah, I think again, the first response, and I want to preface it by saying, personally, my experience has been not as an OPO professional approaching families for donation. So I just want to make sure, put that disclaimer out there. That being said, as a critical care nurse, I've dealt with a number of these conversations. And back in the day, I did approach the families for donation when I worked in England, and it was still appropriate back then to do so. But I think the first step is that we have to overcome our own barriers. Every time I look at case scenarios where things went sideways, if I look and analyze them, it always starts with some barrier that was in place. And quite often an assumption that was made. They're not going to donate anyway. Oh, here we go again. Or I feel intimidated, or whatever it is, right? And so we start with that barrier, and we have to address that barrier and put it aside and recognize, okay, I need to figure out what's important to this family. And then become a student of that person that you're interacting with, that family that you're interacting with. Teach me more, help me understand what's important to you right now. As we start asking those questions and we learn their frame of reference, that cultural frame of reference, now we can then start communicating the message in context of what they understand. Just to give you one example, I remember we had a case where we had a gentleman who was a potential donor, and we had to locate the family who lived very remotely in the mountains of Mexico. They were brought to the US. And when I arrived at the hospital, all the hospital staff said, there's no way this family's going to donate. They don't speak English, and they're praying for a miracle at the bedside. And so I said to them, well, you might be right, but they deserve to know about donation, and we need to find out what their needs are, because donation could really help them in their grief. And so I warned our family care coordinator who arrived about what the staff had said. I told her what I had told them. She went in, she talked to the family about donation. And then the moment, 5 minutes later, literally, she came out and she said, they want to donate. And I said, wow, what happened? And she said, the moment she brought up donation, they said, this is the miracle we've been praying for. And so then she asked them, well, how did you know about donation? And they said, well, we heard about it on the radio in Mexico. And that's the thing, you can never assume, right? Because here we're thinking they're praying for a miracle, they don't understand he's dead. No, they were praying for the miracle of being able to donate. And it's so easy to run with our assumptions. And it's so important to just find out from each individual family, what's important to you in life, what brings you value in death. And then you can communicate your message in context of what makes sense to them.
I think that's great advice. But as you were speaking, I was kind of thinking of the family unit. So in a lot of cases, I would venture to say that families, to your point, are multicultural in and of themselves. So how would you go about balancing those sensitive conversations when you're dealing with families that are comprised of, different ethnicities and gender identities, religious beliefs, things like that? What advice could you offer in those cases? Yeah,
and that's definitely tricky. To your point, every family is multicultural, as we identified, right? but you can have more extremes in cultural differences in some family dynamics than in other families. And again, I'm not an expert when it comes to analyzing, and I'm just going to respond from my perspective with this. I'm sure other people will have other perspectives, but I think ultimately those families are already used to their own dynamic. They're all already working within that complex, if they have such extreme cultural different perspectives and values, they're already used to dealing with that as a family. So I think to some extent we can learn from them and just ask them, first of all, who is the cultural decision maker in the family? Now, I might not use that verbiage with the family, but I might ask somebody in the family who typically leads the decisions in this family. Now, that might not be the same person as the legal decision maker, but we want to engage that cultural decision maker. That being said, we do have to keep in mind that the cultural decision maker could be external to the family, could be some elder in the community. It could be a religious leader of some kind. And we want to make sure they're involved in the conversations, that we're building trust with them, because if not, their voice is going to direct the family. And then ultimately, as we start building rapport, we touch base with each person in the family and just ask them, what is your perspective? What are your thoughts? What are your concerns? What questions do you have? You know, and then you can start communicating. How do you see things? And then you can start speaking to the individual in each family within context of, again, their own cultural frame of reference. It's complex, I'm not gonna lie. I mean,
I can certainly see the challenges in that, but I think to your point, as long as you're being intentional with how you approach the situation and asking questions and just being culturally sensitive overall, you know, you'll eventually get there. So just to go back to what you said earlier about, you know, the risk of making assumptions, I imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that you've been on the receiving end of a lot of stereotyping and assumptions as to why or how you as a white woman would be qualified to, in this case, speak on something like culture. Is that fair?
definitely. I mean, unfortunately, again, I think it goes back to a bit of a perception that only somebody who looks different or sounds different has culture. And I think we've made clear from a definition perspective that's not the case. But unfortunately, it has led me to feel like I need to use my background to justify why I'm speaking on this and where my interest lies with this topic, and that I may have some life experiences that speak to this. But it shouldn't have to be that way. You know what I mean? If we really truly go by cultural humility.
And I agree with that. And I certainly, again, I thank you for sharing your story with us today, not necessarily because we needed you to justify, you know, your expertise or anything like that, but I think it just goes to show that you can be very wrong by judging someone solely based on their cover. So I thank you again for sharing that. Now, I know we don't have time to delve too deeply in detail about this, but I do want to offer our attendees some tools or tips that they can employ moving forward to help navigate some of these conversations with culturally diverse groups. So the premise of our conversation today has been all about embracing those cultural differences through cultural humility. Would you say that that is the key or a great tool or tip to have in your toolbox to navigate those conversations?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it is the key ultimately. I think cultural competence can feel overwhelming if you think about that term and the connotation of competence. But I think if you can develop cultural humility, and what that means is being other oriented. So considering the other needs. Now, it's not about you changing your own values, your own beliefs and practices. It's about learning what's important to the other person and then adjusting to them the communication and the meeting of their needs, even if it makes you feel uncomfortable. That's really what cultural humility is about. And that, quite frankly, goes a little bit against pop culture today, where it's you do you, be true to who you are. Yes, I'm not saying change your values, but if I just communicate the way I want to and I don't adjust to the other person, we're going to keep having misunderstandings. And so I have to be other oriented in thinking about what are their needs and how can I meet their needs.
So you mentioned a few times that the best approach here is, again, to ask questions.
Right.
And what we've heard from our participants and what they've inquired about is, you know, in some cases it's hard to not only know, you know, what questions you should ask, but in some cases, when should those questions be asked? How do you approach those conversations? How do you know when the appropriate time to approach those conversations is? Do you have
Yeah,
any
and
thoughts on that?
sorry, yes. I think when it is tricky, I think the question is, why are you wanting to ask the questions? And then what are the circumstances? If I'm in a professional environment setting, so whether I'm interacting with my colleagues or with patients or patients' families, or I have to keep in mind, do I want to ask these questions to satisfy my own curiosity? Or am I wanting to ask these questions in order to serve this other person more appropriately? So for example, let's say it was with a patient or patient's family. What I would recommend is in that, if it's to serve them better, then it's absolutely appropriate. But what you could do is you could ask for permission. You could, first of all, give a statement, say, I have learned that every person is an individual. Everybody is different, and what's important to them is different. I want to make sure I show you respect and serve you in the best way possible. So I might ask you some questions that seem obvious to you, but it's because I want to make sure I serve you in the best way possible. So may I ask? And then you ask the question, you know, always starting with, may I ask? Glenn, I know you do that quite a bit, and asking for permission gives the other person that opportunity to decline and say, I'm not comfortable with that question. But I think it also demonstrates humility and respect. And I don't recall anybody ever saying no. I think it has to be genuine, you know. Now, if you want to ask questions to learn for yourself, I think if you've built a certain rapport with a patient, their family, with a colleague, given the time, if it's, you know, there's a lull in a space to do so, again, you can ask them, may I ask, can you teach me a little bit more? And then you can ask more questions like about food, about language, about cultural practices, beliefs, etc. And then again, by just asking, may I ask, gives them the opportunity to say, I'm not comfortable. But usually I find people love to share if they see that you genuinely want to learn.
So just to recap, from what I'm hearing, I think it's fair to say that the key here to cross-cultural communication, and I know we haven't been able to talk in grave detail about this, but overall it seems it's all about humility. And in this respect, we're specifically talking about cultural humility. And that requires us to really prioritize the need of the individual that we are engaging with, and being respectful of their perspectives and the views that they bring. Now, I do have a question here from our attendees. Do you believe that cultural competency and cultural humility go hand in hand?
Well, tune into the next session on that one. I think ultimately, I would recommend lay more focus on cultural humility, just because of, as I said, the connotation that competence carries with it. I'm not sure you can ever really be competent in this subject because there's so much involved with culture, but we can talk more about that maybe in a future session.
Absolutely.
But we always can be humble, and yeah, and I think that's the key.
Yeah,
100%. You know, thinking
100%.
about the other person versus what my, you know, purpose is. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, in the interest of time, I do want to be conscious. We have a few minutes left, but we did have a few questions that we received from our participants that I would be interested to hear your thoughts on. So as it relates to DEI, do you have any tips or recommendations on how an organization can go about creating, let's say, a cultural humility, and what members of leadership can do to create that culture within their organization?
I think first and foremost, lead by example. That's where it starts. I think the biggest thing in all of this, we have to remember we cannot change anybody. I think the moment we start getting frustrated with somebody else means we're trying to change them and we're frustrated. And I completely understand the frustration that can come up, right? But it has to start with ourselves. Every single person on this call, every single human being, the only person we can change is ourselves. So it needs to start with self-reflection. What do I need to work on? And then with a lot of grace and kindness and humility, reach out to each other, learn from each other, teach each other, hold each other gently accountable, and give each other especially grace in terms of intent. I think sometimes we can easily jump on judging. And I think that's quite frankly where the history of, I mean, racism and ethnocentrism has been around since the beginning of time. And unfortunately, as human beings, there's a tendency to want to control and to want to set people straight. And it's so easy to judge. And I think the problem is when we go down that route, we start doing the very same thing we are trying to eliminate. And so it has to go back inward. What is it I can work on? And then maybe I can influence the people around me. Maybe people will take my cues and learn, and we can learn together. You know what I mean? Because ultimately we all have opportunities, I think, me included.
Absolutely. And we had quite a few questions on that as far as it relates to, taking your own personal knowledge to educate your family and friends and colleagues, especially those who may be a bit more resistant or in some cases openly prejudiced. So I think that's great advice that I would certainly encourage folks to take advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
So just looking at another question that we have here, as it relates to fatigue in this case, I'd certainly like to get your thoughts on this. They raise the point of one's perspective can also be impacted by compassion fatigue. So how do you go about being sensitive in your approaches and conversations without burning yourself out?
Okay, so are you talking about without burning yourself out or being burnt out and then still being compassionate?
I was trying to say it's more of the latter.
So because compassion fatigue is a big challenge in healthcare, there's a lot of emotional fatigue and compassion fatigue as we talk about, or moral injury is another term that you hear as well. The problem is when you're hurting, it's really hard to become other-oriented because my needs are not being met. And so that's an opportunity for leadership to really look at that and for colleagues to look out for each other, I think, and seeing people who are hurting and their needs aren't being met and seeing what can I do to support that person. On the flip side, I also encourage you to consider when I meet other people's needs and I see their needs being met, that in turn can be so fulfilling. It's almost contradictory. It's a little bit like a donor family donating, right? How does donation even help a family that's grieving? And it's almost that as you pour into somebody else and their needs are being met, it in return now can help fill me up where I'm feeling exhausted and makes me feel like I have a purpose. And that in sense can, I think, to some extent help a little bit with that compassion fatigue. But it is challenging, for sure.
I love that. Well, in the interest of time, I think we can go ahead and pause the conversation there. And I say pause because we certainly want to reconvene. I think you've raised some excellent points for consideration for all of us to take home. And I hope our participants would agree with me in saying this, but I feel a bit more empowered myself to kind of navigate these conversations with, again, friends, anyone. So thank you so much for sharing your insights there. Before we conclude, I do want to offer you the opportunity to share maybe any parting thoughts that you may have or any last minute tips or anything for our attendees.
I think one of the most important things to remember is, as I said, we're all human beings. And I think one of the biggest needs, if not the biggest needs we all have, and this is just my personal theory, is a need to belong. None of us, I think we've all experienced at some point in our life that we were not the first one chosen for the sports team, or the last chosen or ostracized by friends. And it's a horrible feeling. But some people experience that all their lives or experience that acutely for an intense period of time in their lives. That's a pain that sticks with you and can define you. And the moment it's triggered and you feel like you're made to feel like you don't belong, it triggers it all over again. And I think that's, if we can remember that and do everything we can to make other people feel included, feel like they are valued, feel like they belong, I think that will go a long way in starting to build more of that grace community, as such, and helping each other out and learning from each other.
Absolutely. Glen, any thoughts you would like to share?
Just be humble. Let's all get along.
That's right.
Simple. Well, I would just like to say on behalf of the entire Alliance team, I want to extend my sincere gratitude to Hedi for dedicating her time to this program and our overall initiative. We really appreciate all the valuable information that you've shared, and we look forward to bringing you back.
I thank you guys for doing this topic. I think it's so important. Thank you for letting me be part of it. And to the audience as well for all the incredible work that you're doing and for hanging in there for this hour.
Now that said, as I mentioned earlier, I do want to say it's not, I don't want the conversation to necessarily start and stop here. So that's why we are being very intentional with our new DEI focused conversation series. So we certainly encourage everyone in attendance today to tune in for those future programs. In June, as I mentioned, we will be welcoming Hedi back to continue this dialogue. And at that point, we will further explore cross-cultural communication and cultural intelligence, and look a bit more at our common barriers that impact cross-cultural communication. And of course, part of that, as Hedi mentioned, is identifying and addressing our own unconscious and conscious biases. So please, everyone, stay tuned for that. Registration will be announced in the coming weeks. But in the meantime, feel free to explore other topics that will be covered through our conversation series. And all of that information is available on our website at OregonDonationAlliance.org. But given the nature of today's discussion specifically, and a few of the questions that we received and were unfortunately unable to address, I would like to specifically call attention to one of our upcoming programs that will be on addressing minority disparities in access to transplantation. And with that program, we'll be exploring effective practices to educating the African American community on organ donation and transplant. So feel free to join us for that on September 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern. But until then, please be sure to complete your evaluations for today's program. You can provide us with your feedback and certainly share any additional topics that you may want to see us cover in the future. And I do see a couple comments here about whether or not a recording will be available. Yes, we are recording today's session. It will be posted on our website shortly. So feel free to revisit this conversation at any time or share it with your colleagues. But again, we thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Hedi, so much. And
Thank you.
reconnecting with everyone.
Thank you.